In February of 1637, a single tulip bulb in Amsterdam sold for the price of a canal house. Not a painting, not a ship, not a plot of land, a bulb. Merchants had quit their trades. Noblemen had liquidated their estates. Ordinary tradesmen had borrowed against their homes, all to own something that would rot in the ground if you planted it wrong. At the peak, the rarest varieties were changing hands for 10 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsman. And every single person involved believed with total conviction that prices would keep rising. They were wrong. Within 3 months, the market evaporated. Fortunes built over decades dissolved in weeks. And the most disturbing part? It wasn't the greedy who suffered most. It was the cautious ones. The ones who waited too long to exit. The ones who trusted that surely someone in authority would step in before it got truly catastrophic. No one stepped in. They never do. History is not a collection of isolated accidents. It is a single, unbroken pattern, repeating itself with eerie precision across centuries, across continents, across currencies and kings and central banks and digital exchanges. The names change, the instruments change, the language changes, but the sequence never does. And right now, in 2025, 3 specific warning signs are active simultaneously. The same 3 signals that appeared before every major wealth destruction event in the last 150 years. Most people cannot see them, not because the signs are hidden, but because the signs are dressed in the language of prosperity. This documentary will show you exactly what they are. And the question you need to answer before this video ends is a simple one. When the pattern completes, and it always completes, which side of the transfer will you be on? There is a question that historians, economists, and financial analysts have been asking for over 2 centuries. And they keep arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Why do intelligent people with access to historical records, with living memory of the last disaster, with every warning sign visible and documented, why do they walk, eyes open, into the next one? The answer is not stupidity, it is not greed exactly, it is something far more insidious. It is architecture. Every major wealth-destroying event in modern history was not a surprise. It was a building, constructed slowly, floor by floor, over years, sometimes decades. Each floor looked stable. Each new level seemed justified. And by the time the structure reached its fatal height, so many people had staked their livelihoods on its standing, that the very idea of collapse became psychologically impossible to accept, until it collapsed. Understanding how wealth is exterminated, not just that it happens, is the only way to recognize when the building is being constructed around you right now. So before we examine the 3 warning signs active in today's economy, we need to understand the machinery, the 5-phase sequence that has repeated, without exception, in every major financial catastrophe for the last 150 years. Because once you see the architecture, you cannot unsee it. Phase 1. Excess. It always begins with something real. A genuine innovation. A legitimate expansion of trade. A true breakthrough in productivity or technology or resource discovery. This is critical to understand. The seed of every collapse is planted inside something genuinely valuable. That's what makes it so seductive. That's what gives the early participants their confidence. In the autumn of 1873, that something real was the American Railroad Network, the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. Between 1865 and 1873, the United States laid more track than existed in all of Europe combined. Cities that had been frontier outposts became industrial centers almost overnight. Fortunes were being made at a velocity that made skepticism seem like a character flaw. By 1873, railroad securities represented the single largest asset class in the American economy. Banks across the northeastern United States had loaded their balance sheets with railroad bonds. J. Cook and Company, the most prestigious banking house in America, the firm that had financed the Union during the Civil War, had placed nearly all its capital into the Northern Pacific Railroad. The railroad was real. The productivity gains were real. But the capital flowing into railroad securities had long since detached from any relationship to the actual earnings those railroads could produce. The excess phase is when the real thing becomes a vehicle for something else entirely, for speculation, for leverage, for the belief that the asset will keep rising simply because it has been rising. This is phase 1. And in phase 1, everyone is making money. Descent is professionally dangerous. Phase 2, euphoria. 6 months before Jay Cooke and Company suspended payments on September 18, 1873, triggering the first global financial crisis of the industrial age, the newspapers were celebrating America's unstoppable economic ascent. This is the euphoria phase. It is characterized not just by rising prices, but by a specific psychological shift. The belief that this time, the old rules no longer apply. A new paradigm has arrived. The skeptics are fools. The warnings are the ravings of people who missed the opportunity and are now trying to drag others down with them. The euphoria phase has a signature phrase. You will hear it in 1873. You will hear it in 1929. You will hear it in 1999. You will hear it today. This time is different. In the euphoria phase, valuations that would have seemed grotesque 5 years earlier are now explained, rationalized, defended with elaborate intellectual frameworks. New metrics are invented to justify prices that old metrics cannot. The very act of questioning the rally becomes socially uncomfortable. Financial media celebrates the winners. The winners become celebrities. The celebrities write books about why the old rules no longer apply. And underneath all of it, debt is accumulating at a rate that no one is measuring honestly. Phase 3, exhaustion. By the summer of 1906, the American economy had been running hot for over a decade. Railroad expansion had been followed by an industrial boom. Steel, copper, coal, the raw materials of a rising empire were in constant demand. Asset prices had climbed so steadily for so long that caution had been entirely trained out of the market. But something had quietly changed. The rate of new investment was decelerating. Corporate earnings were no longer keeping pace with valuations. Small cracks, dismissed as isolated, temporary, contained, were appearing in the credit markets. A copper trust collapsed in October 1907. Within days, depositors began lining up outside the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York City, one of the most respected financial institutions in America. Within weeks, the panic of 1907 had spread across the country, wiping out banks from Manhattan to San Francisco. This is the exhaustion phase, and it is the most dangerous because it looks from the outside almost identical to the euphoria phase. Prices are still elevated. The mainstream narrative is still optimistic. The experts are still providing reassurances, but the internal mechanisms have quietly reversed. In the exhaustion phase, it is no longer buyers pushing prices higher. It is the absence of sellers that maintains the illusion of stability. The smart money, the institutional investors, the corporate insiders, the people who built the structures, has begun, quietly and without announcement, to exit. They don't announce their exits. Announcements would trigger the panic they are trying to avoid long enough to complete their own escape. The exhaustion phase is when the last wave of retail investors enters the market. The ones who spent the euphoria phase watching others get rich and finally decided they had waited long enough. They are always last. They always pay the highest price. Phase 4. Collapse. On December 29, 1989, the Nikkei 225 index closed at 38,915. It was the highest point in the history of Japanese equity markets. Economists were predicting it would reach 60,000 within the decade. Japanese corporations were buying American landmarks, Rockefeller Center, Pebble Beach Golf Course, Columbia Pictures. Tokyo real estate had become so expensive that the theoretical value of the grounds of the Imperial Palace exceeded the entire real estate value of the state of California. 3 months later, the collapse had begun. What followed was not a correction. It was not a recession. It was a generational destruction of wealth so total, so complete, that it required a new vocabulary to describe. The Nikkei would not come close to its 1989 peak for 34 years. Property values in central Tokyo fell by 80% and did not recover for 2 decades. An entire generation of Japanese workers, the ones who entered the workforce in the early 1990s, who had taken out mortgages at peak prices, who had invested retirement savings at peak valuations, were financially scarred for life. The collapse phase is characterized by a specific and terrifying feature: speed. After years of slow construction, the architecture comes down in days. What took a decade to build can be destroyed in a quarter. And the reason is leverage, borrowed money, amplifying every movement in both directions. On the way up, leverage multiplied gains. On the way down, it multiplies losses with identical mechanical efficiency. The collapse doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care that you invested responsibly. It doesn't care that you were told it was safe. It is a mathematical process, and it runs to completion. Phase 5. Reset. The reset phase is the one that financial history books treat most gently, because by the time it arrives, the damage is done, and there is psychological comfort in describing recovery. But the reset phase contains the most important truth of the entire cycle, and it is a truth that almost no mainstream commentary will state directly. Wealth is not destroyed in a collapse, it is transferred. When asset prices fall 40%, 60%, 80%, the assets themselves still exist. The land is still there, the buildings are still standing, the companies are still operating at some level. What has changed is ownership. The people who held assets on borrowed money are forced to sell at whatever price the market will bear, which in a collapse is almost nothing. And the people with cash, with liquidity, with no leverage, they are standing at the bottom, ready to buy. This is the reset. And it has happened in precisely this way after every single major collapse in modern financial history. The 1873 collapse transferred railroad assets from over-leveraged speculators to a small group of financiers who emerged from the panic as the architects of the next Gilded Age. The 1907 panic transferred banking power so dramatically that within 6 years the United States had created the Federal Reserve, a direct institutional consequence of wealth concentration following collapse. The pattern is not random. The pattern is not a flaw in the system. For some, the pattern is the system. And now, in 2025, all 5 phases are operating simultaneously in different parts of the global economy. The excess is in government debt and technology valuations. The euphoria is in AI narratives and equity markets at historic highs. The exhaustion is in consumer credit, in commercial real estate, in the quiet exit of institutional insiders. The collapse has not arrived yet. And the reset, the great transfer of wealth that follows every collapse, is already being positioned for by those who understand what the pattern means. 3 specific warning signs tell us exactly where we are in this sequence. The first one is the oldest warning sign in financial history, and right now it is flashing at levels not seen since the fall of empires. In the spring of 1788, the French government made a quiet and devastating announcement. It could not pay its debts. Not that it was struggling, not that it needed to restructure, not that it required an emergency loan from a friendly neighbor. The most powerful monarchy in Europe, the ruler of 28 million people, the nation that had built Versailles and projected military force across 4 continents. It was, in the clinical language of state finance, insolvent. The interest payments on France's accumulated war debts had grown so large that they consumed, by 1788, over 60% of all government revenue. Not 60% of discretionary spending. 60% of everything the French state collected. Every tax, every toll, every royal fee, before a single soldier was paid, before a single road was maintained, before a single loaf of bread reached a hungry population. 14 months later, the French Revolution had begun. Historians debate the causes of the revolution endlessly. The Enlightenment, the harvest failures, the incompetence of Louis XVI, the ambitions of the bourgeoisie. All of these played roles, but underneath every political, social, and philosophical cause lay a single, inescapable mathematical reality. The French state had entered a debt spiral from which no exit existed except collapse. That same mathematical reality is present in the global economy today, and it is warning sign number 1. The debt spiral defined. A debt spiral is not simply having a large amount of debt. Nations have carried large debts throughout history and survived. Britain, after World War II, carried debt exceeding 250% of GDP and did not collapse, though it did lose its empire, its reserve currency status, and its global dominance over the following 3 decades, which is a different kind of collapse that we will examine later. A debt spiral is something specific and far more dangerous. It is the moment when the cost of servicing existing debt begins to grow faster than the economy can grow, when that crossover point is reached, when the interest meter is running faster than the income meter. The mathematics become irreversible without external intervention. You cannot grow your way out. You cannot tax your way out, because raising taxes suppresses the growth you need. You cannot cut your way out, because the spending cuts required are politically and socially impossible at the scale necessary. The only exits are inflation, default, or currency collapse. Each one transfers the losses somewhere. None of them are painless, and history shows with brutal consistency that the people who bear the transferred losses are almost never the people who created the debt in the first place. Rome. The first template before France, before Spain, before any of the modern debt crises that populate the history books, there was Rome. The Roman denarius, at the height of the empire's power in the 1st century AD, was struck from silver, so pure that merchants across 3 continents accepted it without question. It was the dollar of the ancient world, the reserve currency of its age. A coin you could carry from Britain to Mesopotamia and spend without negotiation. But Rome, like every empire that followed it, spent more than it earned. The legions were expensive, the borders were expanding. The bread and circuses required to maintain social stability in a city of 1 million people were a permanent drain on the treasury. And so, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, the emperors began to debase the denarius, reducing its silver content to stretch the money supply further. Under Nero, in 64 AD, the denarius was approximately 90% silver. By 200 AD, it had fallen to 50%. By 265 AD, less than 2 centuries later, it contained barely 5% silver. The rest was copper, dressed up with a thin silver wash that wore off within months of circulation. The result was not simply inflation, though prices rose catastrophically. The result was the destruction of trust in the currency itself. Merchants refused denarii at face value. Soldiers demanded payment in kind. Food, land, cattle, because the coins were worthless. Tax collection collapsed because the taxes themselves were paid in debased currency. The administrative machinery of the empire, which ran on monetary transactions, began to seize. No military defeat caused Rome to fracture. No invasion broke it in a single blow. The Western Roman Empire dissolved because its monetary system had been so thoroughly debased that the state could no longer function as a state. The debt spiral, managed through currency destruction rather than formal default, consumed the most powerful institution in the ancient world from the inside. The lesson is not that Rome was uniquely foolish. The lesson is that every empire that has followed the same sequence has reached the same destination. Spain, 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. If Rome provides the ancient template, Spain provides the modern one, and it is almost grotesquely instructive in its clarity. In 1556, Philip II inherited the most resource-rich empire on earth. Spanish galleons were hauling silver out of the Americas at a scale the world had never seen. At peak extraction, the mines of Potosí in modern Bolivia were producing approximately 60% of the entire world's silver supply. Spain had unlimited money. Spain had invincible armies. Spain had colonies on 4 continents and a navy that ruled every ocean. Spain also had permanent war. The cost of maintaining military dominance across the Americas, across the Mediterranean, across the Low Countries, and against the Ottoman Empire consumed every ounce of silver that arrived from the New World, and then more. Philip II borrowed against future silver shipments to fund present wars. He issued bonds called juros against revenue streams that would not materialize for years. He built a financial architecture of extraordinary complexity that rested on a single, fragile assumption that the silver would keep coming, that the wars would eventually end, and that the debts could eventually be repaid. None of those things happened. In 1557, just 1 year into his reign, Philip II declared the first Spanish state bankruptcy in the modern era. Creditors were forced to convert their short-term loans into long-term bonds at reduced interest rates. The financial markets of Europe absorbed the shock. Then it happened again in 1560, and again in 1575, and again in 1596. 4 sovereign bankruptcies in 40 years. The most powerful empire on earth, defaulting on its debts with the rhythm of a broken clock. Each default temporarily relieved the pressure. Each default permanently damaged Spain's credibility with creditors. Each successive loan came at higher interest rates, reflecting the lender's rational assessment that Spain would default again, which Spain then did because the higher interest rates made the debt burden even more impossible to sustain. This is the debt spiral in its purest form, and the end result was not a dramatic military defeat. It was a slow, grinding diminishment, a century of managed decline during which Spain gradually surrendered its position as the world's dominant power to the Dutch, then to the British, while its domestic economy hollowed out, its population stagnated, and its cities filled with the destitute remnants of an empire that had spent itself into irrelevance. The Austro-Hungarian ending. Not every debt spiral ends in slow decline, some end abruptly. In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire entered World War I as one of the great powers of Europe, a sprawling multi-ethnic state of 52 million people with a functioning industrial economy, a sophisticated financial system, and a currency, the krone, that had maintained reasonable stability for decades. 4 years of total war destroyed all of it. By 1918, the Austro-Hungarian government had financed the war almost entirely through debt and money printing. The national debt had increased by a factor of 15. Inflation was accelerating rapidly, and then the empire itself fractured politically, dissolving into successor states that each inherited a portion of the debt while possessing only a fraction of the revenue base that had originally issued it. The Austrian krone collapsed. By 1922, hyperinflation had consumed the savings of an entire generation of Austrians who had done everything right, who had saved diligently, invested conservatively, trusted the institutions of their state. The League of Nations had to intervene with an emergency reconstruction loan simply to prevent total economic disintegration. The Austrian middle class, which had entered the war as a stable, prosperous social group, emerged from it largely destroyed, financially wiped out by a debt spiral that their government had initiated in pursuit of geopolitical ambitions they had no meaningful role in choosing. Their savings did not vanish. They were transferred to those holding hard assets, foreign currency, and gold. America, 2025. The numbers that cannot be argued with. Set aside the historical analogies for a moment. Set aside the empires and the currencies and the centuries of pattern. Look only at the current numbers, stripped of political interpretation. The United States national debt stands at $36.2 trillion. As of early 2025, it is growing at approximately $1 trillion every 100 days, not in a crisis, not during a war, during what the government itself describes as a period of relative economic stability. For the first time since World War II, the United States government now spends more on interest payments, $1.1 trillion annually, than on national defense, more than on Medicare, more than on any discretionary program in the federal budget. The interest payment is now the single largest line item in the United States budget, and it is growing faster than any other. The debt to GDP ratio has crossed 120%. The historical record of nations that have crossed this threshold without significant monetary disruption is not encouraging. It is, in fact, nearly empty. The Federal Reserve faces the same trap that has caught every central bank that has tried to manage a debt spiral through monetary policy. Raise interest rates to fight inflation. and the cost of servicing the debt becomes unbearable faster. Cut interest rates to ease the debt burden, and inflation accelerates, eroding the currency's value and triggering the same destruction through a different mechanism. There is no comfortable path through this. There is only the choice of which form the adjustment takes. France in 1788 had the same choice. It chose neither inflation nor default quickly enough, and the decision was made for it, violently, and by forces that consumed the monarchy, the aristocracy, and over a decade of European stability along with it. The debt spiral is not a prediction. It is not a political opinion. It is a mathematical condition that is currently active in the largest economy on Earth, and it is warning sign number 1. But debt by itself has never been sufficient to trigger a collapse. History shows that debt spirals can persist for years, even decades, before the breaking point arrives. What accelerates them? What transforms a slow deterioration into a sudden catastrophe is when the debt spiral intersects with the second warning sign. And the second warning sign concerns something that most investors check every single day, without understanding what they are actually looking at. On the morning of March 27, 1720, the directors of the South Sea Company met in London to discuss a problem that, by any rational measure, should not have existed. The company, incorporated just 10 years earlier to manage British government debt and trade with South America, had a market capitalization of approximately 200 million. This was, at the time, roughly twice the total value of all the land in England. The company had never successfully completed a significant trading voyage. Its revenues were negligible. Its actual commercial operations were, in any honest assessment, almost entirely fictional. And yet the share price had risen over 800% in 8 months. Members of Parliament had invested. The King had invested. Isaac Newton, perhaps the greatest analytical mind in human history, had invested, sold at a profit, watched the price continue rising, reinvested at the peak, and would ultimately lose the equivalent of several million pounds in today's money. When asked about the experience afterward, Newton reportedly said he could calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. The South Sea bubble collapsed in September 1720. Within 6 months, shares had fallen 84% from their peak. Thousands of British families were ruined. The political fallout consumed the government, and the British economy would carry the psychological scar of the episode for a generation. An instinctive, culturally embedded distrust of financial innovation that historians argue held back British capital markets for decades. What destroyed those investors was not fraud alone, though fraud was present. What destroyed them was a disconnect between what an asset was worth and what people were paying for it. A disconnect so extreme, so detached from any underlying economic reality, that the eventual correction was not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. That disconnect has a name. It has a measurement. And right now, by every serious historical metric available, it is at levels that have only been seen twice before in the last 100 years. Both times, what followed was catastrophic. The measurement that predicted every major collapse. In the 1980s, Yale economist Robert Shiller developed a valuation metric that would become one of the most reliable warning instruments in financial history. The cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratio, known as the CAPE ratio or the Shiller PE, measures stock market valuations not against a single year's earnings, but against the average of the previous 10 years of earnings, adjusted for inflation. The purpose is simple: to strip out the noise of a single exceptional year and reveal the true underlying relationship between prices and economic reality. The long-term average CAPE ratio for the American stock market, measured across more than a century of data, is approximately 17. That means, historically, investors have been willing to pay roughly $7 for every $1 of average annual earnings. When the ratio rises significantly above that level, it signals that investors are paying a premium that can only be justified if future earnings grow faster than historical norms, a condition that, by definition, cannot persist indefinitely. In October 1929, just before the most devastating stock market collapse in American history, the CAPE ratio reached 33. In March 2000, just before the dot-com collapse erased $5 trillion in market value, the CAPE ratio reached 44, the highest ever recorded at that point. As of early 2025, the CAPE ratio stands above 37. It has only been higher once in recorded history. And that one time was the dot-com bubble, which ended in the destruction of fortunes across the developed world and a decade of stagnation for millions of ordinary investors who had trusted the promise of a new, permanent prosperity. 1929. The anatomy of euphoric valuation. To understand what a CAPE ratio above 37 actually means in human terms, not in abstract numbers, but in the lived experience of real people, it is worth examining in precise detail what happened in America between 1927 and 1929. The excess phase of the 1920s boom was, like all excesses, grounded in something genuine. American industrial productivity had undergone a transformation. Electrification, the automobile, the radio, these were not speculative innovations. They were real technologies producing real economic value. Corporate earnings in the mid-1920s were genuinely strong. There was a legitimate foundation beneath the optimism. But by 1927, something had shifted. The stock market was no longer rising because corporate earnings were rising. It was rising because margin debt, borrowed money used to purchase stocks, was flooding the market with purchasing power that had no relationship to economic fundamentals. By the summer of 1929, approximately $8.5 billion in margin loans were outstanding in the American financial system. To put this in context, this was more than the entire amount of currency in circulation in the United States at the time. Investors were borrowing more money to speculate on stocks than actually existed in physical form in the economy. When prices began to fall in October 1929, margin calls went out. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks were required to either deposit more cash, which they didn't have, or sell their positions. The forced selling drove prices lower, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. The cascade was mechanical and unstoppable. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 89% of its value between 1929 and 1932. Not 20%, not 40%, 89%. An investor who had placed $100,000 in the market at the 1929 peak, a sum representing lifetime savings for many Americans, would have seen it reduced to $11,000 3 years later. And the CAPE ratio at the peak? 33, lower than where it stands today. The dot-com mirror. The Weimar Republic in Germany experienced something that financial historians rarely discuss in the context of stock market bubbles, but should. Between 1921 and 1922, as the German mark began its catastrophic devaluation, the German stock market rose dramatically in nominal terms. Germans flooded into equities as a perceived hedge against currency destruction. They were wrong in the most instructive way possible. While stock prices rose in marks, the mark itself was collapsing faster than stocks were rising. In real terms, measured in gold, or foreign currencies, or purchasing power, German stock investors were losing wealth even as their nominal portfolio values soared. The euphoria of rising numbers masked the reality of accelerating destruction. This is a warning embedded within a warning. In an era of currency debasement, nominal asset price gains can be deeply misleading. What matters is not whether your portfolio is worth more in the currency of the day. What matters is whether it retains its purchasing power in the real economy. By 2000, the disconnect between technology stock valuations and economic reality had reached dimensions that even the most enthusiastic participants found difficult to defend with straight faces. Cisco Systems, at its peak in March 2000, had a market capitalization of $555 billion and making it the most valuable company in the world. Its price-to-earnings ratio was 201. To justify that valuation through earnings growth alone, Cisco would have needed to grow its profits at extraordinary rates for the next 20 years without interruption, without competition, without technological disruption, and without a single economic downturn. Within 18 months, Cisco had lost 86% of its market value. AOL, Time Warner, created through what was then the largest corporate merger in history, valued at $350 billion in January 2000, had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent entity within a decade. Yahoo, at its peak, valued at $125 billion, was eventually sold in 2017 for $4.5 billion, a 96% destruction of value over 17 years. These were not obscure companies. These were the most visible, most celebrated, most widely recommended investment vehicles in the world at the moment of their peak valuations. The people who lost money in them were not reckless gamblers. They were ordinary investors who trusted the consensus of financial media, professional advisors, and institutional endorsement. The consensus was catastrophically wrong, because consensus in the euphoria phase is always wrong. Consensus is, by definition, a lagging indicator. It reflects the past, not the future. The three signals active right now. The Shiller-Cape ratio above 37 is one of three interconnected valuation signals currently flashing simultaneously, and their combination is what makes the present moment historically unprecedented in its danger. The second signal is the Buffett indicator, the ratio of total stock market capitalization to GDP, a measure that Warren Buffett himself described in a 2001 Fortune magazine interview as probably the best single measure of where valuations stand at any given moment. The long-term average of the Buffett indicator is approximately 100%, meaning the market is worth roughly what the economy produces in a year. Values above 150% have historically been associated with significant overvaluation. As of early 2025, the Buffett indicator stands above 200%. Warren Buffett's own company, Berkshire Hathaway, is sitting on a record cash pile exceeding $325 billion, the largest cash position in the company's history. Buffett is not making speeches about an imminent collapse. He is simply, quietly, not buying. And when the man who built his fortune on buying undervalued assets systematically refuses to buy anything, the valuation signal embedded in that behavior is worth more than any public statement. The third signal is concentration risk. And it is perhaps the most alarming of the three, because it mirrors with disturbing precision the structure of every previous bubble peak. The top 7 technology companies, Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, and Tesla, currently represent approximately 33% of the entire S&P 500 index. This means that the retirement savings, pension funds, and investment portfolios of hundreds of millions of ordinary Americans are, to a degree most of them do not realize, concentrated bets on 7 companies in a single sector. In 1929, the equivalent concentration was in railroad, utility, and industrial stocks, a small group of dominant companies that seem permanent, inevitable, and immune to reversal right up until the morning they weren't. In 2000, the concentration was in technology, in precisely the kinds of companies that Cisco and AOL and Yahoo represented. The names were different. The structure was identical. Concentration amplifies both gains and losses. On the way up, it creates the illusion of a broad, healthy market, because the indices are rising, and the indices are what most investors track. On the way down, it creates a catastrophic feedback loop, because the forced selling of index funds and passive investors hits the most concentrated positions hardest, driving the largest stocks down the fastest, which drives the indices down, which triggers more selling. The architecture is in place, the building is tall, and here is what is critical to understand about this second warning sign. Debt spirals and fatal valuations, by themselves, do not collapse economies. They create the conditions for collapse, the fuel stacked high and dry. But every collapse in history has required a third element, something that is happening right now, below the surface of the headline numbers, in the daily financial lives of hundreds of millions of ordinary people. It is the warning sign that no one in financial media is leading with, because it doesn't show up in stock indices. It doesn't appear in GDP figures. It surfaces only in the data that most analysts consider too mundane, too granular, too ordinary to be significant. They are wrong. It has never been more significant. On the morning of December 1st, 2001, Argentines woke up to discover that their bank accounts had been frozen. Not partially restricted, not temporarily limited, frozen. The government of Fernando de la Rúa had implemented a policy that would become known in Argentine history as the Corralito, the Little Corral. Citizens were permitted to withdraw no more than $250 per week from accounts that, in many cases, contained the savings of an entire working lifetime. Within days, the restrictions tightened further. Within weeks, the government had forcibly converted dollar-denominated accounts into pesos, at an exchange rate that instantly destroyed approximately 2/3 of their value. The people lining up outside Argentine banks in December 2001 were not reckless speculators. They were not leveraged hedge funds or over-leveraged investment banks. They were school teachers, factory workers, small business owners, and retirees. People who had done precisely what every financial institution and government authority had advised them to do: work hard, spend within their means, save regularly, and trust the system. The system had consumed their savings to service a debt spiral that the political class had constructed over the previous decade. The ordinary consumer, the foundation upon which the entire economic architecture rested, had been the last to know, and the first to lose everything. What destroyed Argentina in 2001 was not primarily a government debt crisis, though that was present. It was not primarily a currency crisis, though that followed. What destroyed Argentina was the moment when the fracture in consumer financial health, visible in the data for years before the collapse, ignored by institutions that had every incentive to ignore it, became impossible to conceal. That fracture is present in the American economy right now, and it is warning sign number 3. The foundation nobody watches. There is a fundamental asymmetry in how financial media covers the economy. Stock markets receive continuous minute-by-minute coverage. Bond yields are tracked obsessively. GDP figures generate headlines. Central bank press conferences are dissected word by word, comma by comma, for hidden signals about the direction of policy. Consumer credit delinquencies receive almost none of this attention. Auto loan default rates appear briefly in specialist publications. Credit card charge-off rates are disclosed quarterly by banks and promptly ignored by the financial press. Negative equity figures, the number of people who owe more on their cars, their homes, their consumer goods than those assets are worth, barely register in mainstream economic commentary, and yet these are precisely the numbers that, in every major collapse of the last 100 years, began deteriorating 12 to 18 months before the systemic crisis became visible to the broader market. They are the leading indicators that the mainstream almost always mistakes for lagging ones, or ignores entirely, until they can no longer be ignored. They are the canary in the coal mine, and the canary is currently not singing. 1928, the consumer installment trap. In the autumn of 1928, a researcher at the Federal Reserve named Winfield Riefler published a study that attracted almost no public attention at the time and has received far too little attention since. Riefler's study documented the extraordinary expansion of consumer installment credit in America during the 1920s. Between 1919 and 1929, the total outstanding consumer installment debt in the United States had grown from approximately $1.4 billion to over $7 billion, a five-fold increase in a single decade. Americans were buying refrigerators, radios, automobiles, and furniture on credit at a rate that had no historical precedent. The consumer economy, the idea that ordinary working people would drive economic growth through continuous personal spending, financed by borrowing, was being invented in real time. It looked from the outside like prosperity, and in important ways, it was. The goods being purchased were real. The productivity gains that made them affordable were real. The rising living standards of American workers in the 1920s were genuinely significant. But underneath the prosperity was a structural vulnerability that Riefler understood and that the broader financial establishment did not want to confront. An economy built on consumer debt is only as stable as the consumer's ability to continue servicing that debt. The moment income growth stalls, the moment unemployment ticks upward, the moment confidence wavers, the installment payments stop. And when installment payments stop, the retailers who depend on them stop ordering from manufacturers, who stop ordering raw materials, who stop employing workers, who stop making installment payments. The feedback loop runs in both directions with equal mechanical efficiency. On the way up, it creates expanding prosperity. On the way down, it creates cascading contraction. By October 1929, when the stock market collapsed and the income destruction began, American consumers were carrying debt loads that made the contraction not merely painful, but mathematically inescapable. There was no cushion. There was no reserve. There was only the next payment, which millions of people could suddenly no longer make. 2005, the subprime signal. 80 years later, the same mechanism operated with the same logic, dressed in the new vocabulary of mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, but structurally identical to the installment credit trap of 1928. Between 2001 and 2006, American household debt grew from approximately $7 trillion to over $14 trillion, doubling in 5 years. The engine of this expansion was the housing market, and specifically the explosion of subprime mortgage lending, loans made to borrowers with impaired credit histories, at initially low teaser rates that would reset dramatically upward after 2 or 3 years. The people taking these loans were not, in the main, sophisticated financial actors making calculated gambles. They were ordinary Americans who had been told, repeatedly and authoritatively, that housing prices never fell on a national basis, that real estate was the safest investment available, and that the monthly payments they were signing up for were affordable by any reasonable standard. The first visible fractures appeared in 2006. Subprime delinquency rates began rising in the second half of that year, quietly in the specialized data, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. By early 2007, the cracks were widening. HSBC announced unexpected losses from its American subprime portfolio in February 2007. New Century Financial, one of the largest subprime lenders in the country, filed for bankruptcy in April 2007. These were not obscure signals. They were explicit, public, documented warnings of consumer financial distress. And the mainstream financial establishment dismissed every single one of them. Contained. Isolated. Not systemic. The vocabulary of denial was deployed with full institutional authority, right up until September 2008, when what had been contained turned out to have contaminated virtually every major financial institution on Earth. The consumer fracture had been visible for 2 full years before the collapse became undeniable. 2 years of data ignored, 2 years of warning dismissed. Iceland, when consumer debt meets institutional collapse. The Icelandic banking collapse of 2008 offers a compressed, almost laboratory-perfect illustration of how consumer financial vulnerability translates into systemic catastrophe. Iceland, in the years before 2008, had undergone an extraordinary financial transformation. Its 3 major banks, Kaupthing, Landsbanki, and Glitnir, had expanded their balance sheets to a combined size of approximately 10 times Iceland's entire GDP. Icelandic consumers had borrowed heavily in foreign currencies, Japanese yen and Swiss francs, because the interest rates were lower than krona-denominated loans. This seemed rational at the time. It was catastrophic in hindsight. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008 and the krona collapsed against foreign currencies, the foreign currency loans that Icelandic households had taken became dramatically more expensive to service. Overnight, without warning, through no decision that the borrowers themselves had made. Mortgages that had been affordable at one exchange rate became impossible at another. The banks collapsed within days of each other in October 2008. The government was forced to guarantee domestic deposits. The IMF was called in for emergency support. The entire Icelandic economy contracted by 10% in 2009. Unemployment tripled. An entire nation's financial system, built on the assumption that consumer debt could be endlessly expanded and globally intermediated, imploded in the space of 72 hours. What happened in Iceland in 72 hours takes longer elsewhere. But the mechanism is the same. America 2025, the fracture in the numbers strip, away the historical context. Look only at the current data. American credit card debt reached $1.17 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2024, the highest level ever recorded. The delinquency rate on credit cards at commercial banks rose to 3.2%, the highest since 2011, in the depths of the post-financial crisis recovery period. These are not recession figures. These are the delinquency rates of an economy that official statistics describe as healthy. Auto loan delinquencies tell a similar story. The percentage of auto loan balances that are seriously delinquent, 90 days or more past due, reached 3% in late 2024, the highest level since the Federal Reserve began tracking the data in its current form. More than 1 in 10 subprime auto borrowers is currently delinquent on their loan payments. Repossessions are running at their highest rate in over a decade. Negative equity, the condition of owing more on a vehicle than it is currently worth, now affects approximately 1 in 5 Americans with an auto loan. These are people who cannot sell their vehicle to escape the payment without arriving at the dealership with a check to cover the shortfall. They are financially trapped, paying monthly for an asset that is worth less than what they owe, with no exit that doesn't cost them money they don't have. The two-tier economy has never been more starkly visible. Americans who own significant financial assets, stocks, real estate, investment portfolios, have seen those assets appreciate dramatically over the past decade of low interest rates and monetary expansion. Their balance sheets look healthy. Their spending has held up. Their confidence surveys register positively. Americans who depend primarily on wages, who rent rather than own, who have minimal investment assets, who rely on credit to smooth the gaps between income and expenses, are deteriorating. Their debt service costs have risen as interest rates have climbed. Their purchasing power has been eroded by years of inflation that wage growth has not fully compensated for. Their savings buffers, depleted during the post-pandemic period, have not been rebuilt. The 70% of American GDP that depends on consumer spending is increasingly being sustained not by genuine consumer prosperity, but by the last available credit line, by the buy now, pay later service, by the cash advance on the credit card, by the refinanced auto loan stretched to 84 months to make the monthly payment manageable. These are not the financial behaviors of a stable consumer economy. These are the financial behaviors of consumers approaching the limit of what borrowed money can sustain. And history is perfectly clear about what happens when that limit is reached. Not what might happen, not what could happen under adverse conditions. What always happens, because the mathematics are not negotiable. And the mathematics have been the same in 1929 and 2001 and 2008 and in every other episode where consumer financial health deteriorated to this point before a systemic event. 3 warning signs, all 3 active simultaneously. All 3, in historical context, at levels associated with the period immediately preceding catastrophic wealth destruction. But warning signs do not cause collapses. They illuminate the conditions in which a collapse becomes inevitable. What converts potential into kinetic, what transforms the stacked fuel into the actual fire, is something specific. Something that, throughout history, has arrived in 5 distinct forms. And the conditions for all 5 of those forms are currently present in the global financial system. On the morning of May 11th, 1931, the directors of Kreditanstalt, Austria's largest bank, the most prestigious financial institution in Central Europe, the bank that had financed the Austro-Hungarian Empire's industrial expansion for 3 generations, walked into their offices and made a decision that would change the course of history. They would announce their insolvency. The bank's losses, accumulated quietly over years of deteriorating loans to struggling industrial companies in the aftermath of World War I, had finally exceeded what could be concealed, restructured, or papered over with accounting creativity. The announcement was made on a Saturday morning. calculated to give governments and financial authorities the weekend to formulate a response. The response was inadequate. Within days, bank runs had begun across Austria. Within weeks, they had spread to Germany, where depositors, witnessing Austria's crisis, began withdrawing funds from German banks that were carrying their own concealed losses. The German banking system, already weakened by the reparations burden imposed at Versailles, began to fracture. Within months, the contagion had crossed the English Channel and attacked sterling. Britain abandoned the gold standard in September 1931, a monetary event that sent shockwaves through every economy still pegged to gold. A single bank failure in Vienna, a cascade that reshaped the global economy for a decade. The Creditanstalt collapse did not cause the Great Depression. The depression was already underway. The debt spiral, the fatal valuations, the consumer fracture were all present and deteriorating. What the Creditanstalt collapse did was convert a slow deterioration into a sudden catastrophe. It was not the disease. It was the moment the fever broke, violently, systemically, and without mercy, for anyone caught in its path. This is the trigger mechanism. And understanding it is the difference between being blindsided by a collapse and understanding, in the moment it begins, exactly what you are watching. The architecture of triggers. Triggers are not causes. This distinction is critical, and it is one that financial media consistently obscures, because attributing a collapse to a specific dramatic event is narratively satisfying in a way that the true explanation never is. The true explanation is always that the conditions for collapse were fully assembled long before the trigger appeared. The debt was already unsustainable. The valuations were already fatal. The consumer fracture was already advanced. The trigger did not create any of these conditions. It simply removed the final psychological barrier, the collective agreement to pretend that the conditions didn't exist, and allowed reality to assert itself at the speed that markets move when fear replaces complacency. Throughout modern financial history, triggers have arrived in 5 distinct forms. They are not equally likely at any given moment. They are not random. They emerge from the specific vulnerabilities that the preceding excess phase has created, which means that examining the current structure of the global economy makes it possible to identify which triggers are most dangerous right now. Trigger. Type 1. The institutional failure that reveals contagion. The Creditanstalt collapse belongs to this category. So does the failure of Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008, the single most studied financial event of the 21st century, and still the most instructive. Lehman Brothers did not fail because it was uniquely reckless. It failed because it was uniquely visible. Now, by September 2008, dozens of financial institutions were carrying similarly impaired assets, mortgage-backed securities, whose underlying loans were defaulting at rates that made their stated valuations fictional. The difference between Lehman and the institutions that survived was not the quality of their balance sheets. It was the decision made by the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve over a single weekend to allow Lehman to fail rather than engineer another rescue. That decision, whether correct or catastrophically wrong remains debated, revealed something the market had been desperately trying not to confront. The contagion was not contained. The impairment was not isolated. The interconnections between financial institutions, through derivatives, through repo markets, through commercial paper, meant that the failure of one significant institution threatened to pull down others in a chain reaction that no individual actor had the power to stop. Within 24 hours of Lehman's bankruptcy filing, the Reserve Primary Fund, a money market fund considered one of the safest investment vehicles available to ordinary Americans, announced it had broken the buck, meaning its net asset value had fallen below $1 per share due to its exposure to Lehman paper. Within 48 hours, institutional investors were pulling hundreds of billions of dollars from money market funds across the industry. Within 72 hours, the commercial paper market, The mechanism through which corporations fund their day-to-day operations had effectively frozen. A functioning global financial system came within days of complete operational collapse. Not metaphorically, literally. The payment systems that move money between banks, that process payroll, that enable corporations to purchase inventory, these systems were on the verge of seizing entirely. The trigger had been pulled. What it revealed was that the conditions for catastrophe had been fully assembled for years. Today, the equivalent vulnerabilities exist in the commercial real estate market, where approximately $929 billion in debt is maturing between 2025 and 2026, much of it held by regional banks at valuations that have not been honestly marked to current market prices. The institution that triggers the next cascade may not yet be famous, but its failure, when it comes, will make it unforgettable. Trigger type 2, the currency or bond market dislocation. In December 1994, the Mexican government made an announcement that it had been postponing for months, hoping that circumstances would change sufficiently to make it unnecessary. It would devalue the peso. The devaluation itself, a 15% reduction in the peso's value against the dollar, was intended to be controlled, surgical, and confidence-preserving. Within 48 hours, it had become a rout. International investors, who had poured capital into Mexico's high-yielding peso-denominated treasury bonds called tesobonos, realized simultaneously that a 15% devaluation was likely the beginning of a process rather than a one-time adjustment. The selling became self-reinforcing. The peso fell 50% within weeks. The Mexican economy contracted by 6.2% in 1995. Unemployment surged. A middle class that had spent a decade building modest prosperity was financially devastated in the course of a single quarter. The Mexican crisis was contained, barely and at significant cost, through a $50 billion emergency rescue package assembled by the United States Treasury and the IMF. The package was controversial, deeply unpopular with American taxpayers, and successful only in the sense that it prevented the contagion from spreading to other emerging market economies with similar vulnerabilities. Today, the bond market vulnerability in the United States itself presents a trigger risk of an entirely different order of magnitude. The Treasury market, the deepest, most liquid financial market in the world, has experienced episodes of dysfunction in recent years that would have been considered impossible a decade ago. In March 2020, the Treasury market briefly froze. The buyer of last resort in the global financial system temporarily ceased to function normally, requiring emergency Federal Reserve intervention. In September 2022, the British gilt market experienced a disorderly collapse that destroyed pension funds and brought down a government within weeks. These were warning shots, not the event itself. Warning shots. The conditions that produced them have not been resolved. They have been managed temporarily with interventions that have added to the very debt burdens that created the vulnerability in the first place. Trigger. Type 3. The geopolitical shock. On October 17, 1973, the members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States and Western Europe in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Within 3 months, the price of oil had quadrupled. The American economy, built on the assumption of cheap and reliable energy, was blindsided in a way that no financial model had anticipated. Petrol rationing, odd-even purchase days, lines stretching around city blocks at filling stations across the country. Inflation, which had been elevated but manageable, became a structural feature of the American economy for the remainder of the decade. The 1973 oil embargo did not cause the inflationary crisis of the 1970s. The seeds of that crisis had been planted when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, unleashing monetary expansion unconstrained by any hard anchor. But the embargo was the trigger that converted a latent vulnerability into an active catastrophe. Suddenly, publicly, and at a speed that no policy response could match. The geopolitical trigger landscape today is, by any honest assessment, more complex and more dangerous than at any point since the Cold War. Supply chain dependencies that took decades to construct have been revealed through recent experience, to be fragile in ways that peacetime assumptions never anticipated. A conflict involving Taiwan, the source of the majority of the world's advanced semiconductors, would represent a supply shock for which no Western economy has a credible contingency plan. Energy dependencies in Europe, exposed dramatically in 2022, have been partially but not fully resolved. Trigger, Type 4, the Northern Rock moment. See. In September 2007, British television showed images that had not been seen in the United Kingdom since the 1860s. Queues of ordinary people stretching around the block outside bank branches, waiting to withdraw their savings. The bank was Northern Rock. The cause was not initially insolvency. Northern Rock was solvent by standard accounting measures at the moment the queues formed. The cause was the bank's dependence on wholesale funding markets rather than retail deposits. When those markets froze in August 2007 following the first eruptions of the American subprime crisis, Northern Rock could no longer fund its mortgage book. The Bank of England provided emergency liquidity. The news of that emergency liquidity support was made public, and ordinary British depositors, hearing that their bank had needed emergency support from the central bank, did the entirely rational thing. They went to get their money. The Northern Rock bank run was a trigger of a specific and underappreciated type. A liquidity crisis driven not by insolvency, but by confidence. The bank did not fail because it had lost money. It failed because people stopped believing it wouldn't. In a fractional reserve banking system, that distinction is ultimately meaningless. A bank that loses the confidence of its depositors is a bank that will fail, regardless of what its balance sheet says. Confidence, once lost, does not return on command. It cannot be legislated back into existence. It cannot be restored by press releases or reassuring statements from authorities. It can only be rebuilt through time. And time is precisely what financial systems do not have when a trigger has been pulled and the cascade has begun. The loaded chamber 5 trigger types. 5 mechanisms through which accumulated financial vulnerability converts into acute systemic crisis. And in 2025, credible candidates for each of those trigger types are present simultaneously in the global financial system. The commercial real estate debt maturity wall. The treasury markets demonstrated fragility. The geopolitical flashpoints across 3 continents. The regional banking sectors concealed losses. The consumer credit system approaching its functional limit. Any one of these in isolation might be managed, might be contained, might be absorbed through the institutional mechanisms that exist precisely to prevent individual failures from becoming systemic ones. But the warning signs we have examined, the debt spiral, the fatal valuations, the consumer fracture, tell us that the shock absorbers have been worn down. The buffers have been depleted. The institutional capacity to absorb a significant trigger event is not what it was in 2008, when the tools deployed to prevent total collapse were being used for the first time. They have been used since, extensively. The emergency has become the routine. And when the next trigger arrives, in whatever form, from whatever direction, it will find a system that has already spent its reserves of resilience. What follows a trigger event, the actual mechanics of how wealth is destroyed, transferred, and ultimately reconcentrated, is a process that history documents with clinical precision, and it always unfolds in exactly 3 stages. On the morning of September 16, 1992, the British government made an announcement that would permanently alter the political landscape of the United Kingdom, end careers that had taken decades to build, and transfer an estimated $3.4 billion out of British public reserves and into the accounts of private investors, primarily into the accounts of one man. The announcement was simple. Britain was withdrawing from the European exchange rate mechanism. The pound sterling, which the government had spent weeks insisting it would defend at any cost, was being allowed to float freely. The man who had positioned himself on the other side of that defense was George Soros. Soros had spent the preceding months constructing a short position against the pound worth approximately $10 billion. Borrowed sterling sold in anticipation that the currency would fall. His analysis was straightforward. Britain had joined the ERM at an exchange rate that was too high relative to the country's economic fundamentals, and the interest rates required to defend that rate were causing visible and accelerating damage to the British economy. The mathematics of the situation were, in Soros's assessment, irreconcilable with political sustainability. He was right. In a single day, Black Wednesday, as it became known, Soros made approximately $1 billion. The British Treasury lost $3.4 billion attempting to defend the indefensible. Ordinary British citizens pay for that loss through higher taxes and reduced public services for years afterward. This is the three-stage process of wealth destruction operating at the sovereign level, compressed into a single dramatic day that makes the mechanics unusually visible. The denial phase, during which British authorities insisted the pound would be defended. The cascade, during which the defense collapsed with stunning speed. The transfer, during which wealth moved from public accounts to private ones, from the many to the few, with the mathematical efficiency that always characterizes this process. But Black Wednesday, dramatic as it was a relatively contained event. The full three-stage process, operating across an entire economy, consuming the savings of millions of ordinary people over months and years, is both more complex and more devastating. And it is this full process that history documents with such terrible consistency. Stage 1. The denial phase. The denial phase is the most psychologically sophisticated stage of wealth destruction, because it is the stage during which the destruction is most actively concealed, most institutionally defended, and most dangerously invisible to the people it will ultimately harm most. The denial phase has a consistent cast of characters, a consistent vocabulary, and a consistent duration. It begins the moment the first credible warnings of systemic stress become public. It ends the moment the stress becomes impossible to deny, which is always later than it should be, and always too late for most ordinary investors. In the months following the initial subprime warnings of 2006 and 2007, the denial phase operated with extraordinary institutional discipline. Ben Bernanke, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, testified before the Joint Economic Committee in March 2007 that the problems in the subprime mortgage market appeared to be contained. The word was chosen carefully. It conveyed technical precision. It conveyed authority. It conveyed, above all, that the people responsible for managing the system had assessed the risk and found it manageable. It was not manageable. It was not contained. And the people testifying to its containment either did not know the true state of the system, which would represent a catastrophic failure of institutional intelligence, or did know and understood that acknowledging the truth would accelerate the very cascade they were trying to prevent. Both possibilities are equally disturbing. The denial phase serves a specific function in the wealth destruction process. It creates the window of time during which the sophisticated actors, the institutional investors, the corporate insiders, the people with access to granular data rather than official reassurances, complete their exits. Every week that the denial phase successfully maintains public confidence is another week during which positions can be reduced, hedges can be constructed, and cash can be accumulated quietly, without the panic that honesty would trigger. By the time Bear Stearns collapsed in March 2008, the event that most sophisticated observers later identified as the true beginning of the visible crisis, the denial phase had provided 18 months of cover. 18 months during which those with knowledge and access repositioned. 18 months during which ordinary investors, trusting the institutional consensus, maintained or increased their exposure to assets that were already fundamentally impaired. The 1930s offer an even more extended and devastating example. Following the October 1929 stock market collapse, JP Morgan Partners publicly purchased stocks on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, a deliberate theatrical display of confidence designed to slow the panic. President Hoover convened meetings of business leaders who publicly pledged to maintain investment and employment. The Federal Reserve issued statements suggesting the financial system was fundamentally sound. For 3 years, 1930, 1931, and 1932. The denial phase extended and deepened the eventual damage. Investors who might have liquidated positions at a 30% loss in late 1929 instead held through a decline that ultimately reached 89%. The denial phase did not prevent the collapse. It guaranteed that when the collapse was finally undeniable, it was far worse than it needed to be. Stage 2, the cascade. The cascade is the shortest stage. It is also the stage that most people, when they imagine a financial collapse, picture in its entirety, which is why they consistently underestimate both the speed and the totality of the destruction. A financial cascade is not simply prices falling. It is the mechanical unwinding of leverage, the simultaneous forced selling by millions of actors who borrowed to invest and are now being required to sell regardless of price, regardless of timing, regardless of the fundamental value of what they hold. It is the withdrawal of liquidity from markets that had assumed liquidity was permanent. It is the discovery that the buyers who were always present during the ascent have, in the space of days, entirely disappeared. In October 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 12.8% on October 28th and a further 11.7% on October 29th. In 2 trading days, more wealth was destroyed, in nominal terms, than had existed in the entire American economy a generation earlier. The speed was not a feature of the technology of the era. It was a feature of leverage, of the margin debt that had inflated the ascent and was now mechanically amplifying the descent. In September and October 2008, money market funds, instruments that hundreds of millions of Americans had been told were equivalent to cash, experienced a silent bank run of approximately $300 billion in 48 hours, not in stocks, not in high-yield bonds, in money market funds, the instruments used to park cash safely while deciding where to invest it. The cascade does not discriminate between the reckless and the prudent. It does not reward caution. In a system sufficiently interconnected, and the modern global financial system is interconnected to a degree that would have been unimaginable to the architects of previous collapses, the forced selling of the over-leveraged contaminates the portfolios of the conservative. Pension funds holding sound assets are forced to sell them to meet redemptions from panicking investors. Insurance companies liquidate quality bonds to cover claims. The cascade transforms selective impairment of bad assets into a broad destruction of all asset values simultaneously. This is what happened in 2009 when BlackRock and the large private equity firms began their systematic acquisition of distressed residential real estate across the United States. They were not buying at the bottom because they were clever. They were buying at the bottom because the cascade had forced millions of ordinary Americans, people who had lost jobs, people facing foreclosure, people whose retirement accounts had been destroyed, to sell assets at whatever price the market would bear. The price the market would bear at the bottom of the cascade was approximately 30 to 40 cents on the dollar in many American housing markets. Assets that had represented the primary store of wealth for entire communities, the homes in which families had invested decades of mortgage payments, were acquired at generational discounts by institutions with capital, with patience, and with the liquidity that the cascade had stripped from everyone else. The 1998 Russian financial crisis provided a compressed version of the same process. When Russia defaulted on its domestic debt in August 1998 and allowed the ruble to collapse, the cascade that followed transferred industrial assets, oil companies, metals producers, utilities, from the state and from dispersed public ownership into the concentrated control of a small number of individuals who had positioned themselves with foreign currency and access to the acquisition mechanisms. The oligarchic structure of the Russian economy, the concentration of industrial wealth in a dozen hands that characterizes Russia to this day, was not the product of privatization policy alone. It was the product of a financial cascade that the well-positioned exploited with systematic efficiency. Stage 3. The transfer. The transfer phase is the one that never makes the documentary films. It is not dramatic in the way that bank runs and stock market collapses are dramatic. It proceeds quietly, methodically, and over years, conducted through legal mechanisms, through foreclosure proceedings, through bankruptcy courts, through the entirely legitimate exercise of financial power, by those who retained it while others lost theirs. But the transfer phase is, in the long arc of financial history, the most consequential stage of the entire process, because it is in the transfer phase that the ownership structure of an economy is permanently reorganized, that the distribution of wealth between the many and the few is reset in ways that persist for generations. The Cyprus Bellion of 2013 provides a small-scale but crystalline illustration of how the transfer operates at the institutional level. When Cypriot banks, massively over-leveraged through exposure to Greek sovereign debt, faced insolvency in March 2013, the rescue mechanism agreed upon by the European Union and the IMF included something that had never been done before in the modern era of deposit insurance: the direct confiscation of depositor funds above $100,000 to recapitalize the banks. Overnight, wealthy depositors at Bank of Cyprus, many of them Russian business people, but also Cypriot citizens who had accumulated legitimate savings over lifetimes of work, lost 47.5% of deposits above the insured threshold, not through investment losses, not through their own financial decisions, through a regulatory mechanism that transferred their savings directly into the capital structure of the institution that had mismanaged its way to insolvency. The transfer was legal, it was structured, it was executed without drama by men in suits in Brussels and Nicosia. And it permanently destroyed the financial position of thousands of people who had done nothing wrong except keep their money in a bank that the government had regulated, endorsed, and insured, up to the point that the cost of the failure exceeded what the government was willing to absorb. This is the uncomfortable truth that the transfer phase forces into focus. In a financial collapse, the rules that were presented as permanent and protective turn out to be contingent and reversible. The deposit insurance that was guaranteed turns out to have limits. The pension benefits that were promised turn out to be negotiable in bankruptcy. The property rights that seemed inviolable turn out to be subject to extraordinary measures when the system requires it. The three stages, denial, cascade, transfer, are not random sequences. They are not unfortunate accidents. They are the predictable, documented, historically consistent process through which financial systems resolve the imbalances that excess, euphoria, and exhaustion have created. And the most important thing that history teaches about the three stages is this: by the time stage 2 begins, stage 3 has already been planned. The institutions and individuals who will acquire the assets at the bottom are not improvising. They are not opportunists stumbling upon bargains. They are prepared. They have studied the same historical record. They have seen the same warning signs. They have spent the denial phase doing precisely what the denial phase allows, positioning themselves on the correct side of the transfer before the cascade makes the direction of flow impossible to reverse. 3 warning signs, 5 trigger mechanisms, 3 stages of destruction. The pattern is complete. It has operated in this precise sequence across 5 centuries of financial history, across empires and republics, across gold standards and fiat currencies, across agricultural economies and industrial ones and digital ones. There is one final question that this documentary must answer. Not whether the pattern is real. The historical record is beyond dispute on that point. Not whether the conditions are present. The data makes that argument without requiring interpretation. The final question is the one that every person watching this has been asking, silently, since the opening frame. What does any of this mean for me? In October of 1956, the British government made a decision that its own foreign secretary described, in private correspondence, as an act of collective delusion. It invaded Egypt. The stated purpose was to retake the Suez Canal, nationalized by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser 4 months earlier. The real purpose, understood by everyone in the room where the decision was made, was to demonstrate that Britain remained a global power capable of projecting force independently, without asking permission from Washington, without deferring to the newly constructed architecture of the United Nations, without acknowledging what the balance sheets of the British Treasury had been stating with increasing urgency for the preceding decade. Britain was broke, the pound was fragile, the empire was dissolving, and the political class, faced with the arithmetic of irreversible decline, chose to act as though the arithmetic didn't exist. The Americans were not amused. President Eisenhower, furious at being kept uninformed about an operation that risked destabilizing the entire Middle East during the Cold War, instructed the Treasury to begin selling American-held sterling reserves, a move that would trigger a run on the pound and force a humiliating British withdrawal unless London complied with Washington's demand to stand down. Britain stood down. Within days, the most powerful empire the world had ever known, the civilization that had industrialized the planet and written the rules of global trade for 2 centuries, retreated from a military operation in a developing nation because the United States threatened to collapse its currency. The Suez Crisis did not cause the end of the British Empire. The empire had been ending for a decade. The debt spiral from 2 world wars, the loss of India, the exhaustion of the productive base that had funded imperial ambitions. Suez was simply the moment when the gap between Britain's self-image and Britain's actual position became impossible to maintain simultaneously. The empire did not end with a battle. It ended with a phone call from the American Treasury. The British public did not know how close the pound had come to collapse during those October days. The full details of American pressure were not disclosed for decades. Ordinary British citizens, the people who had fought the wars, paid the taxes, and built the economy whose proceeds had funded the imperial project, learned the truth only in retrospect, through declassified documents and historians writing in the quiet distance of subsequent generations. By then, of course, there was nothing they could have done about it. The 3 warning signs, a final reckoning. We have examined in precise historical detail 3 warning signs that are currently active in the global economy simultaneously. Warning sign. 1 is the debt spiral, the mathematical condition in which the cost of servicing accumulated debt grows faster than the economy can grow, closing off every conventional exit and leaving only inflation, default, or currency collapse as mechanisms of resolution. This condition destroyed the French monarchy, bankrupted the Spanish Empire 4 times in 40 years, debased the Roman denarius from 90% silver to 5% over 2 centuries, and has preceded every major sovereign financial crisis in modern history. It is currently active in the United States, at levels $36 trillion in national debt, $1.1 trillion in annual interest payments, debt to GDP above 120%, that have no historical precedent in peacetime. Warning sign. 2 is the fatal valuation disconnect, the condition in which asset prices have detached from any reasonable relationship to underlying economic reality, creating a structure in which the eventual correction is not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. The Shiller-Cape ratio above 37, the Buffett indicator above 200%, the dangerous concentration of index exposure in 7 technology companies, representing 33% of the S&P 500. These numbers place current American equity valuations in the company of 2 prior moments in financial history. 1929, which was followed by an 89% market decline, and 2000, which was followed by a decade of destroyed wealth and shattered retirement plans for millions of ordinary investors. Warning sign 3 is the consumer fracture, the quiet, unglamorous, underreported deterioration in the financial health of the people upon whom 70% of the American economy directly depends. Credit card debt at record levels. Auto loan delinquencies at their highest since the post-crisis recovery of 2010. Negative equity trapping millions in financial positions they cannot exit. A 2-tier economy in which asset owners have prospered while wage earners have been silently hollowed out by the compound effects of inflation, rising debt service costs, and the exhaustion of pandemic-era savings buffers. 3 warning signs. Each one, in isolation, would be cause for serious concern. Together, operating simultaneously, they constitute the precise configuration of conditions that has preceded every major wealth-exterminating event in the last 150 years. Not similar conditions, not approximately comparable conditions, the same conditions. The clock, one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of understanding financial history, is accepting a truth that feels profoundly unsatisfying. The pattern can be clearly visible, the conditions can be fully assembled, the warning signs can be unmistakably active, and the collapse can still be years away. This is not a flaw in the analysis, it is a feature of the system. Financial systems are not governed by precise mechanical clocks. They are governed by confidence. And confidence, as John Maynard Keynes observed, can remain irrational longer than most people can remain solvent waiting for rationality to reassert itself. Japan's Nikkei reached its fatal peak on December 29, 1989. But the conditions that made that peak fatal, the real estate bubble, the over-leveraged banking system, the corporate cross-holdings that made the entire financial structure a single interconnected entity, had been fully assembled years earlier. Analysts who correctly identified the bubble in 1987 were correct about the diagnosis and early about the timing. Some of them were professionally destroyed by being early. The bubble continued for 2 more years after the warnings became impossible to dismiss analytically. It continued because confidence continued, because the institutional actors who understood the fragility had not yet decided collectively that the moment of exit had arrived. When they decided, the collapse took approximately 3 months to become undeniable and approximately 10 years to fully resolve. This is the clock. Not a countdown timer with a precise endpoint, a process with a clear direction, a clear destination, and a timeline that cannot be known in advance, only inferred from the accumulating weight of the evidence. The evidence currently weighs heavily in one direction. The $1929 billion in commercial real estate debt maturing in 2025 and 2026 is not a future risk. It is a present one. Loans coming due right now on properties whose current market values are in many cases substantially below the outstanding debt. The regional banks holding that debt are not abstract institutions. They are the community banks and mid-sized lenders that provide credit to small businesses, that hold local deposits, that constitute the capillary system of the American financial body. Their impairment is not visible in the headline indices. It is visible in their earnings reports, in the commercial real estate vacancy data, in the quiet absence of refinancing activity in markets where refinancing should be abundant. The Federal Reserve's policy dilemma is not a future problem. It is an active constraint on the present. The Fed cannot meaningfully cut interest rates without risking the re-acceleration of inflation. It cannot maintain current rates without watching the debt service burden on the federal government and on the millions of Americans carrying variable rate debt grow with each passing quarter. The room to maneuver that existed in 2008 when rates could be cut from 5.25% to near zero and held there for years does not exist in the same form today. The emergency tools have been used. The balance sheet has been expanded. The extraordinary has become ordinary, and ordinary tools are what remain. The consumer fracture is not decelerating. The delinquency data is moving in one direction, at one consistent pace, quarter after quarter. This is not a temporary spike caused by a specific event. It is a structural trend, the predictable mathematical consequence of sustained real wage stagnation combined with elevated interest rates, combined with the exhaustion of the savings buffers that temporarily obscured the underlying deterioration. The clock is not stopped. It has never stopped. It runs continuously in one direction through the accumulated weight of conditions that cannot be indefinitely sustained. What history teaches about survival. It would be dishonest, and it would violate everything this documentary has tried to do. To conclude with a simple list of financial recommendations, as though the historical record being described is a problem soluble by the correct portfolio allocation. The historical record is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be understood, prepared for, and navigated with open eyes. But history does teach specific lessons about who survives these events and who does not. And those lessons are worth stating directly, without qualification, because they are not intuitive. And the unintuitive ones are the ones that matter most when the cascade begins. The first lesson is that cash is not safety, but cash is optionality. Every major collapse in modern financial history has involved a phase, sometimes brief, sometimes extended, during which the price of every asset falls simultaneously. In these phases, the people with liquid capital, actual purchasing power that requires no forced selling to access, are uniquely positioned. Not because they avoided losses on assets they don't hold, though that matters, but because they can act when others cannot. The people who acquired distressed assets at the bottom of every collapse were not the people who predicted the timing perfectly. They were the people who had preserved their capacity to act when the cascade created the opportunity. The 1930s taught this lesson definitively. The people who entered the Depression with significant cash reserves, a small minority, emerged from it having acquired assets at prices that represented generational opportunities. The people who were fully invested in equities, in real estate, in the financial instruments of the era, were consumed by the cascade regardless of the quality of their individual selections. The crash does not evaluate the merit of what you own. It evaluates only whether you own it on borrowed money and whether you have the liquidity to survive the duration. The second lesson is that concentration is the enemy of survival. Every major wealth destruction event in history has been characterized, in its aftermath, by the revelation that the people most severely damaged were those who held the largest proportion of their wealth in the asset class most severely affected. The Argentine middle class in 2001 held their savings in peso-denominated bank accounts, a single, concentrated, entirely domestic exposure. When the Corralito froze those accounts and the conversion to pesos destroyed their value, there was no buffer, no alternative, no second position to fall back on. Diversification is not primarily an optimization strategy. It is a survival strategy. It is the acknowledgement that the future is uncertain, that confidence in any single asset class or institution is historically unjustified, and that the cost of being wrong about a concentrated position in a collapse scenario is categorically different from the cost of being wrong about a diversified one. The third lesson, and this is the one that financial history states most clearly, and that modern financial culture most systematically ignores, is that the quality of your information matters more than the quality of your investments. Every major transfer of wealth in the historical record was preceded by an information asymmetry. The people on the winning side of the transfer knew something, or understood something, or had access to data that allowed them to see something that the people on the losing side did not. In 1929, J.P. Morgan and his associates knew from direct contact with the corporate and banking system that the credit structure was impaired in ways that the public had not been told. In 2007, the hedge funds that profited from the mortgage collapse had done the analytical work, reading the actual loan files, examining the actual default rates in specific zip codes that the ratings agencies and institutional investors had not done or had chosen not to do. The information was available. It was not secret. It was simply inconvenient, and so it was not sought. The people who survived and prospered in the aftermath of every major collapse were not necessarily the richest before it happened. They were the most honestly informed. They were the ones who had looked at the data without the filter of the consensus, who had applied historical pattern recognition without the distortion of institutional optimism, who had accepted the uncomfortable conclusions that the numbers demanded rather than reaching for the comfortable conclusions that institutional authority offered. The uncomfortable synthesis. Spain's empire did not collapse because the Spanish were foolish. They were not. The administrators of the Spanish crown were sophisticated, educated, and aware of the financial pressures bearing down on the empire. They managed those pressures, deferred them, restructured them, and ultimately failed to resolve them. not from lack of intelligence, but from the structural impossibility of their situation. The debt had grown beyond the capacity of the productive economy to service it. The only exits available were ones that no political actor with power had an incentive to choose. Britain's empire did not end because the British lacked resolve. They did not. The political class that managed Britain's decline after World War II was, by any reasonable assessment, more competent than most of its predecessors. But competence is not sufficient when the mathematics are irreconcilable with the desired outcome. Britain had borrowed more than it could repay to win wars that left it exhausted and indebted. The empire could not be sustained on the revenue of an economy that had been hollowed out by the effort of building and defending it. The mathematics demanded resolution, and the resolution came gradually, then suddenly, in the form of the phone call from Washington that ended the pretense at Suez. The Soviet Union did not collapse because its people lacked patriotism or its leadership lacked determination. The system collapsed because it had spent 40 years prioritizing military capacity over productive efficiency, accumulating the costs of imperial overextension, while the productive base that was supposed to fund those costs stagnated. By 1985, the Soviet state was spending 15 to 20% of its GDP on the military, a burden that would have been crushing for any economy, and that was fatal for one that could not generate the growth to offset it. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991, 900 days from the first fracture to the final dissolution of a nuclear superpower. 900 days. The Ottoman Empire's final decades offer perhaps the most sobering parallel of all, because the Ottoman decline was so prolonged, so clearly documented, so exhaustively analyzed by contemporaries who understood exactly what was happening, and so completely impossible to arrest despite that understanding. The empire had been called the sick man of Europe for decades before its final collapse in the aftermath of World War I. Its debt structure was under international administration. Its revenues were pledged to foreign creditors. Its territorial losses were accelerating. Every informed observer knew the direction of travel. And yet the empire continued for decades after the diagnosis was undeniable. It continued because empires, like financial systems, can sustain conditions that analysis identifies as fatal for far longer than analysis predicts, until they cannot sustain them for a single day longer, at which point the collapse is total, sudden, and irreversible. The choice? This documentary has not been an exercise in pessimism. Pessimism is an emotional response to difficult information. What has been presented here is something different. An analytical framework derived from historical evidence, applied to present conditions, producing conclusions that the evidence demands, regardless of how uncomfortable those conclusions are. The three warning signs are real. The historical pattern they represent is real. The mathematical conditions that make a significant wealth destruction event not merely possible but probable are real. None of this is speculation. Every claim made in this documentary is grounded in documented historical events, in publicly available current data, and in the pattern recognition framework that the historical record itself has established. And the historical record is equally clear about one more thing. The existence of warning signs does not guarantee a specific outcome on a specific timeline. It guarantees a direction of travel. It establishes the weight of probability. It does not constitute a precise forecast, because precise forecasting of complex adaptive systems is not possible, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What the warning signs do is change the rational calculus of preparation. When the system is stable, when valuations are reasonable, when debt levels are manageable, and when consumer financial health is solid, the cost of carrying excessive caution is real. You forego returns. You hold cash that earns less than the market. You maintain diversification that constrains your upside. When the system is in the configuration that we have documented, when all three warning signs are simultaneously active at historically extreme levels, the calculus reverses. The cost of being wrong about the danger is categorically higher than the cost of being wrong about its timing. The person who prepares and experiences a false alarm has lost some return. The person who dismisses the warnings and is wrong loses something that cannot be easily recovered. History does not ask whether you found the warnings convincing. History does not grade you on the sophistication of your analysis or the elegance of your counter-arguments. History presents the bill, and the bill is calculated in purchasing power, in asset values, in the financial security of families and communities and generations. The people who understood the warning signs before 1929 and acted on that understanding did not merely survive the Depression. They acquired assets at the bottom of the cascade that formed the foundation of generational wealth. The people who understood the subprime warning signs in 2006 and positioned accordingly did not merely avoid losses. They watched the cascade create opportunities that had not existed since 1933 and would not exist again for decades. They saw what others refused to see. They acted on what others dismissed. And when the transfer came, as it always comes, they were on the correct side of it. The British Treasury, in those October days of 1956, knew the pound was fragile. The people making the decisions about Suez knew. The intelligence was there. The analysis was available. The warning signs were legible to anyone who chose to read them honestly. They chose, instead, to act as though the empire was still the empire it had been. As though the mathematics could be overridden by will, by prestige, by the accumulated weight of centuries of institutional authority. They were wrong, and ordinary British citizens, the ones who knew nothing of the phone calls from Washington, the ones who read the newspapers and trusted the official reassurances, paid for that wrongness in ways that took a generation to fully resolve. The pattern does not exterminate wealth randomly. It exterminates the wealth of the unprepared, the uninformed, and the institutionally dependent. The people who trusted that someone in authority was managing the situation, that the warning signs were being monitored, that the system had safeguards sufficient to prevent the worst outcomes. Sometimes those safeguards hold, sometimes they don't. And the historical record suggests, with uncomfortable clarity, that they are least likely to hold precisely when they are most needed, when the conditions are most extreme, when the accumulated imbalances are most severe, when the trigger, in whatever form it takes, finally arrives. 3 warning signs, all 3 active, all 3 in historical context, at levels that demand to be taken seriously. The clock is running. The pattern is in motion. The choice, as it has always been, as it was for every generation that faced this moment in its own time, is entirely yours.